Okay. Welcome to everyone who's joined us today for the webinar. This is the final installment of the Sentio Sync webinar series for the year. And my name is Mbuso Zulu. I'm a senior analyst at Sentio Capital. And we're very privileged today to be joined by three supply chain and manufacturing experts. We've got Zanele Salman, who's an experienced business development, investor relations, and strategic communications executive. She has over 21 years experience in the manufacturing industry, and she currently runs her own consulting and advisory firm, Isibani C, which is a business development, investor relations, and strategic communications firm. She's worked for corporates such as Cecil, Nampak, and Barloworld. And as an advisor now to companies and associations in the manufacturing sector, she helps companies achieve improved performance. She holds an honors in chemistry and an MBA. Second on the panel is Photy Tzellios. Photy started his early career in consulting. He soon found his niche in the retail sector and has held directorships at large corporates in retail, such as ShopRite as well as Pick n Pay. He has specialist knowledge in supply chain on the African continent, having serviced businesses in approximately 20 countries in Africa as well as India. He began, okay, sorry about that. Photy was instrumental at ShopRite in modernizing the approach to retailing by moving the business towards actively managing its supply chain. And finally, we have Tumisang Matsheka. He's a customer service focused supply chain professional with more than 20 years of experience, mainly in operations and supply chain. He's worked across many large organizations such as Danone, as well as Nampak, Coca-Cola Shanduka, Tiger Brands, and currently where he is now as a VP of Supply Chain Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's at PepsiCo. Thank you so much to our panelists. We're very privileged to have an esteemed set of panelists, and it should make for an interesting discussion today. So just to lay out the backdrop, we've had the COVID pandemic, and that's led to, we've had the COVID pandemic, people have been locked down at home, and nothing else to do really but to drive up demand and consume products over the past 24 months or so. But that's then been met with a lack of a supply side response. You've seen port congestions, serving freight rates, etc., and the supply chain unable to respond to this demand push that's come through. Now, the question is, it's as a result of globalization, but we live in this globally connected economies and societies that are interdependent. What have all these supply chain blockages meant for globalization and interconnectedness as we have it? I'll just open up to the panel and you guys can just give us your thoughts on that. Photy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think you explained it quite nicely. It has been a catastrophe because every single component of the supply chain has been hit, which is different to any other previous crisis that has affected either a country or a set of products. And I think what it has highlighted is our dependency on, in particular, China and Asia, as those are the manufacturing sectors of the world. You know, China today accounts for about 16% of global economic output. And I think we are on the African continent, kind of China sneezes, and we're looking at being impacted for the first time in 25 years. So Africa's global output will probably drop by somewhere between 30 and $120 billion, it's estimated. So it's quite a knock. And what it means for each company is that product didn't arrive on the shelf, and costs went up. Container costs went, let's say, from $2,000 US on an average to 4,000 quite quickly. And then it's only about 3 weeks ago that the shipping companies started dropping rates. So all of that gets built up into the cost of product. So everyone gets impacted.
Yeah. Dumi, just from your guys' perspective as an international manufacturer, can you just share some anecdotes of how this has specifically impacted you as a corporate?
Yeah, thanks, Mbuso. Look, I think as Photy has put it, we have been exposed. Most manufacturers around the globe have been exposed to the dependency on import, raw material, and we have felt that impact. So we had massive delays of input material coming into our factories. In some instances, we've had no product coming into the factories, let alone delays. And it has meant that we find alternative raw materials to substitute the materials that we are used to procuring. So it has really pushed the supply chains, but I think it has also given us an opportunity to collaborate better within organizations. It has given us the opportunity to adapt quickly and be more resilient and more responsive, to the changes around the market. So whilst it has been a very difficult period for organizations to respond, I think it has given us the opportunity to build a resilient, supply chain across the globe, and a more competitive supply chain around the globe. So I think that, after, we've gone through this very difficult period, the supply chain landscape globally will actually be in a much better position going into the future.
Yeah, but Dumi, you also acknowledge that you benefited from being part of a multinational, where you could draw on that to get access to some of the materials that you need. Can you just share on that? And then following that, I'll ask Zanele then to speak to the experience of a local small medium enterprise and how this has impacted them.
Yeah, certainly. So I think, big organizations and particularly multinational organizations have, had it slightly easier because we can draw from our global, network and scale around the world, to navigate the difficult periods. So we can pull material outside of India or outside of Germany, instead of the usual, source location. So that has helped. That has certainly helped, and it certainly has also helped in terms of the lead times. Where we have global contracts with specific suppliers, we have been able to leverage off that and get the material slightly earlier than what a local organization would be. But we have certainly been exposed. We have felt it. It has just been, if you like, slightly easier than what a small organization would have felt. Yeah.
Zanele?
Yeah, just to talk to, firstly on a small cap company that I normally work with. So on average, their lead times in terms of delivery of products that they import from the East in particular, it used to be about 6 weeks to 2 months delivery lead times. And now they're having to deal with 3 to 4 months waiting period. And that increases the cost, obviously, exponentially. And one particular company that I've worked with, they found that it has now become cheaper to actually backward integrate their operation in South Africa and source some of the products in South Africa. They've also taken the opportunity to revive some of the operations that they had shut down because they were uncompetitive. But with the rising costs of some of the raw materials coming particularly from the East, as well as you add on the costs of waiting for the products to be delivered, it's become even cheaper, reasonably competitive to produce in South Africa and revive those industries where they've been able to bring back some of the individuals that they had retrenched to start working again. So I think that is a more positive case for South African industry, manufacturing industry. And I think we're going to start seeing more of those kind of trends starting to take shape in the country. I mean, we've spoken earlier about, the collaborative nature of various industries in terms of sustaining some of the products that are currently being produced in the country. And I think leveraging those relationships and those partnerships and seeing what can be done to produce more of the raw materials in South Africa or in our neighboring countries competitively, I think will benefit the industry going forward.
Yeah. So the whole idea with globalization and global trade is that you leverage on economies of scale. So the most competitive countries will produce, the most competitive from a pricing and speed perspective will produce most of your products. And with this disruption, you've seen the nearshoring that you're talking about. Do we see this as more sustainable, or is it maybe just a short-term response, supply response from corporates, and that over the longer term, companies will revert back towards where they have those economies of scale? Photy, can you speak on this?
Okay, I think that everything's been exposed with this pandemic, and that's the reality. Now, what we must understand is that China responds quickly. So within the second quarter of 2020, they'd already recovered as an economy. Now, Japan, on the other side, when they did their studies, it took them up to the fourth quarter of 2020. So it depends country on country. The supply chains are so complex, and there's so many components, and whatever we do in South Africa, there's not a single product that doesn't have something that comes from abroad. So we're not self-sufficient, and neither are the developed countries, even the USA. So it depends on what industry you're in. If you think about automotive, they were the hardest hit of all the industries, and manufacturing, of course. And then you have, let's say food retail, which is probably less hit relative to them. Of course, the finance industry or financial industry was probably the least hit. But if one looks at it and you say, let's go onshoring, everyone's talking about it and being, it's topical, and it's part of what one tries to do, considering that you want to do it locally or you want to do it regionally. However, if you consider all the components that go up to make just one single product, you can't just do that. It's a tiered structure. So in the automotive or manufacturing industries, you say, I'm going to manufacture locally or I'm going to assemble locally. But in essence, components will still come from abroad. And I think that economics run the show. And in the short term, I doubt whether that will happen. Everyone's thinking about it. I think probably the US is a little bit more strategic to that. They set up a task team to look at supply chains. And in particular, they're looking at strategic areas like defense and healthcare and high tech that they would try and motivate to come back. But they can't do it 100%. We're a global world. I think we need to make our supply chains more resilient, more agile. And I think a lot of people have woken up to trying to understand their own supply chain. People have been procuring product without understanding how it actually all comes together. So you sometimes think that you're buying locally, but that local company from which you're buying is dependent on parts coming from abroad. So, we can theoretically talk about it. I doubt whether it's going to be possible to do it for all industries. It's on a selected basis, and one has to be more strategic today rather than focusing on just in time with everything.
Yeah, so I'd like to explore a bit further just on making those, how do we make those supply chains more resilient? But just from a consumer perspective, we've just come from Black Friday. We saw the product in store, but Black Friday is just one data point in the broader festive season trading, which is very important for retailers and the economy overall. What can we expect for festive season trading? Will we have products? At what price is that product going to be? Because judging from the Black Friday discounts, it wasn't all that attractive as you've seen in the past couple of years. So what have the global supply chain challenges meant from a pricing perspective? Because companies have incurred this cost already. To what extent will that be passed on to the consumer? And generally looking out then a little bit further, how far or how long can we expect this inflation to persist for?
Okay. Yeah, look, I think what we'll see two things. So we'll see, part of an increase, in prices, because, manufacturers have had to, adjust, for commodity inflation. So, some of that will definitely be passed into the consumer, no doubt about that. So that's the first thing that we will see, which we have already seen. But secondly, we will also see less variety on the shelf, where you had a lot to choose from. I'm sure you probably would have noted from Black Friday itself. You had little variety this time around, and that is because of the shortages on supply, and manufacturers have had to prioritize, run fewer, SKUs to try and increase the output, as opposed to covering, all the different SKUs. So those are certainly the two things you will see now, and you will continue to see into the first quarter of 2022.
But just the level of that inflation, I'm just concerned, what do you expect it to do to demand? Is the high inflation maybe we may see now on certain products going to persist, or can we see then some deflation in the medium term?
I think Photy will probably have a much clearer view on that, being closer to the consumer and the behavior of the consumer. But from a manufacturer's point of view, we certainly think that it is going to put pressure on the consumer. What it's going to really do to demand, I'll hand that to Photy.
I think that if one looks at it, I think the consumer at first is fairly well buffered, because the pressure is put upstream in the supply chain. So retailers try and maintain a certain price point and try not to jump too aggressively from one price point, from let's say 1 Rand to 10 Rand. You can't do that, because that will then affect demand. So between retailers and manufacturers, they actually buffer it for a while. However, the reality is that in the long term, the consumer pays for everything, and that is including the profit margins along the way. So if shipping costs increase, then you can imagine that shipping costs will flow downstream to the consumer with the, let's say, margins added on from manufacturing and retailing. So consumers inevitably pay for the lot. If you look at what has happened over this kind of Black Friday, you won't find aggressive deals because stock isn't as easily available. And I think it's also that the consumer has been very hesitant in going out and spending. So there is this fear, and demand has been set back a bit by that. So I think the natural, let's say, dynamics cannot take care of both the demand and the pricing. If you say, will inflation rise? It hasn't been aggressive since 1974, but I think what the world will see in the next, let's say, decade is prices going up. And the funny thing is that when prices go up, very rarely do they come down. And I think for the consumer, it's not a bright, let's say, medium term.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers it.
Yes, I mean, from a Sentio perspective, our view has been that, our initial view, in fact, was that the high inflation that we're seeing currently will be transitory. But as it stands right now, our view is that the inflation is persistent for the short term, but for the second half next year, we do expect to have been over the hump, so to speak. And it's this tension as well that you're talking about that's evident in the central banks with their hesitancy to raise rates, as an example, and even just the pace of the taper in the case of the developed economies. So I think we do agree with you that inflation will be high. But we also disagree in the sense that we see some structural themes over the medium to long term that will see inflation tapering and actually being relatively muted. And just to go into a few of these, we call them the 3Ds. Debt is one, the developed economies' debts and countries' debts. The demographics, where you have old people getting older generally. And you don't have so much of a youthful population coming through, and Gen Z and millennials spending more of their money on experiences relative to goods, so to speak. And then you have disruption, which one of the benefits is that it does drive costs lower. So over maybe the medium to long term, we view inflation as being relatively muted.
Mbuso, that might be true. The thing that is new, though, in what is taking place is restarting ships that have been parked, restarting plant that has been parked. Those are fundamental costs that will come in, and it's difficult to get rid of them. The second one is that if you look at reshoring, in other words, that you're going to come closer to making things local, then there's a cost to that. Because for years we've all been focusing on buying at the lowest cost, and that has pushed manufacturing to the east. Bringing it back adds cost. So I don't know, if the economics will kind of control that, or if strategic decisions will control that. So I think there's something that has been disrupted. It definitely won't go back to what it was. We can say that.
Yeah, no, I like a little bit of dissent. Zanele, you also run an fitness apparel store. What's your experience been, and how are you thinking about passing inflation through to the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, so we manufacture and sell also to the consumer. What we found is that obviously we've had, from a raw materials point of view, we've had struggles in terms of getting products through to South Africa for us to utilize in our operations. We've seen costs for raw materials increase by as much as 30% into our processes. And we've seen also that consumers are a lot more reluctant to spend on expensive items. They're more really looking for bargains. We've seen a lot of bargain hunting, and we've seen peak whenever you run specials, whenever you run promotions, and then just nothing when you're not running promotions and when you don't have giveaways and things like that. And so we basically now in a very difficult position where we need to stock out. So we need consumers to buy products from us. However, we can't price at the same price that we had initially targeted. So we have to run specials just to get working capital in that we can stock up. We can then stock for the next season. So, and I see a lot of much smaller retailers and manufacturers really going through the same process of just, balancing the act between getting cash in and remaining relevant in terms of the industry and being able to supply what the consumers need at a particular time. It's been very, very difficult. It's a difficult process to juggle, because I find with medium and even small enterprises, there's very little support. So, you can't call the bank to assist immediately. There's processes to go, it takes a long time. Even the systems and other measures that government has put in place to assist small and medium enterprises, they're just not flexible enough for the time that we're in, and they're not responsive to the true challenges and issues that some of the SMMEs are facing. And so it's going to be a continuous struggle. We've seen quite a number of companies drop off and not exist anymore. We've seen individuals going back to corporate environments and looking for jobs. And then it's just weathering the current situation and making sure that, you keep food on the table at least. So job losses and some industry players just falling off with the likelihood that they might come back at some time, but that will be costly too. But it has also for the SMMEs that are a lot more resilient and have some capital, access, it's given them leverage to then take market share and expand into various industries. So we've seen those trends.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, just thinking around inventory, because that's your working capital. So what really will be the trade-offs that companies will make from a just-in-time procurement strategy, where you're optimizing your working capital, and then on the other hand, you've got deliverables. Manufacturers have deliverables to retailers, for example, to supply all the order in time, in full, on time in full rather. And on the other hand, you've got this working capital funding dynamic. Tumi, let me rather start with you. From a manufacturing perspective, are you able to supply as per the service level agreements that exist with the retailers or your customers?
Yeah, look, it has been difficult. It has been difficult to do that, but I think the collaboration with retailers as well, has helped. Where we've had to prioritize, as I said earlier on, prioritize certain SKUs over others, just to make sure that we at least have a product on the shelf. So it hasn't been easy, Mbuso. But what we need to do as manufacturers, to your point around the trade-offs around working capital and so forth, what we do need to do is we need to take the whole agenda of localization seriously. It is something that has been on the table even prior to COVID, but it's something that we have not taken serious enough. Because of the benefits of importing and landing product here a lot cheaper than we can from elsewhere. The bottom line is our country requires that localization to happen, because it also helps in stimulating that demand within country, right? So it's the right thing to do, localization has never been so important in the boardrooms. It's something that we take serious. and there is definite commitment and investment behind that, both in as far as the capacity and the capability. Because for a long time, what has also been a challenge to manufacturers is the capability within our country to be able to produce the quality that we require, and the complex products that we require. So long term, we need to invest in local capacity. Secondly, in the short term, we have to invest in resilience. And what does it mean? We have to increase, our stock holding in the short term, which is one of the things that has caused us havoc around the world, because demand has gone up, because everyone is trying to increase their stock holding and buffer themselves, and is creating massive tension across the entire supply chain. But it's something that needs to be done. It's something that you can only do in the short term. You cannot sustain that level of working capital, but certainly something that we need to do in the short term.
Yeah. And Photy, how do retailers cope with the discontinuous supply chain?
Look, I think in South Africa or in Africa, we're probably blessed because our supply chains have been discontinuous. So the consumer just does pantry loading. So when you find the product on the shelf, you buy more of it. And the retailer does the same like the consumer. So everyone buffers up stock. So we're used to that. When you say about service levels, I don't think that we have the service levels that they have in the developed world of, let's say, Europe or the States, where people are at a 99.8% availability. So in South Africa, I think, depending on the product, the average in supermarketing, funny enough, even to this age, after many decades of being in retail, is at about 65%. You order 100, you're going to get 65 of those. To increase it, you've got to warehouse it. So if you want to take the 65 and make it 95, you've got to hold the buffer stock. So talking about just-in-time inventory and just-in-time shipping is going to be the thing that changes. So everyone's going to buffer up. I think, as Wang said, it is that you buffer up. You're going to put in more working capital. Now, working capital is a limited resource. You can't buffer up for every single article. You buffer up for strategic articles. And the strategic articles, I think, people will move to, as I said, strategic approaches and look at which suppliers, which products are you going to home in on. The other thing that Tumisang said that makes sense is that, and if you look at it, what saved things in the short term here between retailers and manufacturers is the relationship that a lot of cooperation and working together took place to make things more, let's say, easy for the consumer. So collaboration is the theme going forward. And I think the other thing that is clear is who has invested in digital technologies, in other words, in software that allows you to have more transparency of your supply chain. So you have real-time visibility, and both the retailer and the manufacturer need to see that. So it's not always about just in time, it's actually about visibility, so that if something's going to hit you, how can you be proactive and take the necessary steps to guide the process through, that you're not promoting product that's going to dry up for a month or two, because lead times are sometimes long. So I think the beauty is relationships got better.
All right. Yeah.
Just to quickly build the one point, sorry, Mbuso, on that. The benefit of the localization. Now, as we know, we have been exposed, and particularly so on the imported material. But that has been a challenge, from a working capital point of view for the longest of times, right? Because of the nature of the lead times and all of that, manufacturers have had to build massive warehouses to keep this raw material in these warehouses. But the extent to which we can localize will actually improve that situation. Because if we have it locally sourced as manufacturers, there's no need to carry that high inventory. And so it will also have that, beneficial outcome, the localization agenda.
Okay. All right, so then we've touched on it at various points, but let me just pause here right now. To our attendees, if you would like to ask a question to the panelists, please just pop it through and then I'll send on the question, but then there also will be time a little bit later on to go into a Q&A, but you can in the meantime be sending through those questions. Okay, so we touched on building resilient supply chains and a resiliency in that. So in order to not be as caught unawares as we were this time around, what else do we need to do in order to just entrench that and to ensure that whatever gains have been made so far, those are contained and even built upon? So visibility, localization, what else can we do? Zanele, do you want to start and then everyone else can go after?
Yeah, I think we touched on as well collaborative work between industries and ensuring that we're all working towards the same goal. But I do think that we do need government intervention at some point in terms of just having the right policies that support localization, that enable localization, and also enable any other advanced technological implementations that certain industries require. And I think also we do need to take a more long-term view when we look at what needs to be done for the country and for the various industries that operate in South Africa for the long-term benefit, which would be employment, right? And that's really the greatest need that South Africa has, is to be able to absorb the various numbers of individuals that are currently seeking employment but unable to find employment. And I think that's, something that can be tapped into, but you do need the right support. You do need the right partners around the table, talking and discussing and understanding the challenges and issues the same way to enable then the collaborative solutioning towards some of the challenges that will enable industries to grow, to leverage the resources that the country already has, and also to grow even beyond the borders of South Africa. But obviously for manufacturing, competitiveness and an ability to leverage efficiencies, which is economies of scale, is quite crucial. You can't operate without that. And those are some of the areas I think that need solutioning around. And I think looking ahead, we're talking about COVID and supply chain and how that has impacted various industries. But I do think with looking at industries of the future, looking at companies that are looking at decarbonization strategies, for example, and industries of the future, there's a lot that South Africa can leverage and various industries can leverage to position for competitiveness for globally, particularly looking at renewables in South Africa. In terms of our renewables endowment, we have the best, one of the best factors globally. And it's about how we then, while we're looking at finding solutions for current industries that we have, but how do we then ensure that the various industries are able to leverage some of the positives that are coming through with the various trends that we're seeing across the world, and being able to position ourselves to then leverage that for future growth and ability for the country and the various industries to prosper going forward.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add on the question is, what do we need to hold on to? I think we need to hold on to, the capability that we developed over the last 2 years of responding a lot faster. What we have seen in organizations, COVID has forced us actually to be a lot more agile and to be a lot more collaborative within the organizations. At the onset of COVID-19, when there was no material coming in, we had to work, very hard to find alternatives. And sometimes something that would have taken about 4 months, to do and get to an outcome, took us about 2 weeks, because we had no options. We had to move quick to be able to, to continue business. So that is one thing that we have seen, and it's one thing that I think we need to hold on even going into the future, because it's becoming a lot more complex. As you know, we are now living in this what is termed the VUCA world, and that VUCA world is not going to stop. It's still going to increasingly become relevant. One example, for instance, in Photy space is around the checker 6060 that has been brought in, where you order and in 60 minutes you've got your order at your door. It's going to try in supply chains to be a lot more responsive, and I think we therefore need to make sure that we take the experience from the last 2 years into the future.
Yeah, Photy, your thoughts?
Look, I think there are so many aspects to touch on, but what is clear is what this pandemic has done is it's got us to understand that we've got to change our mindset. So that's the first thing. The second part is that organizations, for once, start to realize the strategic nature of supply chains or supply chain management within the organization. Because this time around, both demand and supply was affected. So it wasn't just the tsunami that hit Japan, and stopped supply from Japan. This was a worldwide, crisis. And when you hit demand and supply, two things change at the same time, bringing much complication. And I'm going to go through to something that Zanele said, which is fundamental. And that is, if you want to build capacity going forward, one of the pillars out there that you've got to focus in is policy, and policy comes from government. Now, the Americans are actually very good at, taking policy decisions and putting money out there. So without government support to actually bring industry back and create the necessary jobs, because one of the key aspects that we need to look at in this country is about employment and about our labor, how we actually work together in kind of going forward. The other thing is that the world is going digital. So one of the interesting aspects is that trade up to now has been very paper-based. And taking trade towards a digital world will probably introduce things like artificial intelligence or the robotics of doing certain activities, so that when you position a purchase order, all the components go through on time, and that includes finance. And in the world of finance in which you're interested in, I think financial institutions want to take control of all the transactions downstream in the supply chain, so that you've got visibility all the way through and you're financing it. Because it is about working capital, before you commit to a purchase order. And I think purchase orders might in future become discounted, so that at least you can get working capital up front. So this pandemic has created so many different opportunities. If you look at the consumer side, I think retailers had to be fast in looking at offering consumers options, because if you're stuck at home, how do you actually go about shopping? So some of the local retailers were able to kind of take online shopping to a higher level through the pandemic. So that has been a catalyst in that. Then, of course, it's about developing skills. We need to, I think, invest in developing skills for a different way of kind of working. And I think it's interesting times, because we're not going to go back to exactly where we were. The other thing I think that, can't remember if it was Tumisang or Zanele that touched on sustainability. So that comes in. And with sustainability is also the circular economy. So instead of mining for raw materials, we might have to use, and I think a lot of countries will start looking at how do they reuse materials that they have out there rather than throwing them away and putting them into, let's say, landfill. So I think we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to change the world of trade as we know it and practices that go with it. Yeah. But with all of that, we need political stability. So,
definitely.
Political help and political stability is necessary. Business doesn't do things on their own unless there's policy that brings everything to a common price, to a common playing field.
Yes, definitely. Definitely agree with that. And just on the investment that's needed, one of the key themes has been like investment in the Internet of Things, AI. So firstly, can companies afford the level of investments that's required to ensure that those supply chains are resilient? And can an Internet of Things solution be applied to the supply chain to the extent that it isn't already? Will we see this accelerate?
Yeah, look, I think how do organizations invest towards this resilience that you mentioned? I think we've got to invest in capacity. I think that's the first thing. And the investment in capacity, either by, backward or forward integrating is one option. But I think more than that is about how do we increase the capacity and capability within the greater ecosystem, not necessarily within the organization. But certainly, a capacity investment is going to be important, beyond COVID-19, because as I said, the world that we live in today requires that level of responsiveness, and you need the capacity to be able to respond to that level. The investment, look, the Internet of Things and its importance in supply chain is already at play, right? Today, sure, we are able to see where raw materials are in the world. We are able to monitor that, the storage of those raw materials, and we are able to run digital factories around the world through investment in IT and the Internet of Things. But we are behind the rest of the world as a country and as a continent. So there is a lot of upside in that investment in improving our efficiencies and the customer experience that we need to accelerate.
Look, I think if I can take a retailer perspective, I think everyone is trying to get closer to the consumer, or trying to at least understand the consumer's demand and nuances, because competition is tough out there, and whoever banks the money first wins. So I think the Internet of Things is one of the steps that will kind of bring aspects together, and it is about living in a more digital world. And I think a world where I think we're all battling with our privacy. How much information am I willing to pass on to either a retailer, manufacturer, a healthcare provider, an insurer, etc. that won't be used against me. So I think the world is going to go through, and that's why I said it's about mindsets. The world's going to go through a challenging time, and it's about how we manage demand and do business within that. And doing business is going to be more complex, and there's no one that can afford not to delve with options, and technology gives you those options. So you can't, at whatever the cost is, avoid working with technology. What it might be is prohibitive for small industries. But once again, there are ways of financing sectors. China didn't just start from doing cheap little products that were disposable 20, 30, 40 years ago. Today they're on the high end. It took them 40 years to build an infrastructure. And if we want to do something in this country, we have to build a similar infrastructure to what China has done. In other words, enable technology so that business can take place. In other words, someone's got to invest the big money so that small individuals and various medium-sized companies can progress with regards to technology. Mm. So I think we're in South Africa always caught in this space, and we're saying it's too expensive, but it's not.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add a couple of points regarding manufacturing. So with most, what I've seen, working in the industry for many years, is that a lot of our operations and factories were built a long time ago. So the machines are 40, 50, 60 years old. And trying to integrate those processes with regards to internet, and new technologies and all the advancements with regards to technology and what the Internet of Things enables us to do is difficult, and it's a hurdle that most corporates need to be able to jump so that they're able to leverage efficiencies. And how it helps having technology and Internet of Things in terms of operations is that it enables you to measure, it enables you to track, and also optimize from an efficiency point of view. And that's money in the pocket for manufacturers, right? If you can optimize your efficiencies and make sure you produce the right quality product at the right time in right amounts to supply to your customers. And I see a bit of a lag with some of our manufacturers in terms of just jumping over and leveraging some of those opportunities, going back to the point that you need capital to be able to do that, and sometimes some manufacturers don't have the capital, so you're forced to really operate how you've been operating, and managing as best as you can. However, also from a technology point of view, there is opportunities to introduce robotics and mechanization in manufacturing. However, it's a very crazy balance, because we have to balance between efficiencies and competitiveness as a manufacturer with the jobs that you will have to potentially lose, and individuals that you will potentially have to train, but then they don't have the right skill to be retrained to operate those robotics. And those are the dynamics, I think, when you start talking technology and the Internet of Things, that from a manufacturing point of view, those are the discussions that need to be had. And for most, it's very difficult to then make the jump, because there's various things that you have to balance. And it's not a uniquely South African, phenomena, but I think there needs to be a concerted effort again from, government.
Yes.
That
leads on to one of the questions, yes, that we have on the chat. And the question is just what role can regulation or labor law changes, what role can they play to assist in solving this problem in production and the supply chain bottlenecks? So I think, you can finish your thoughts, Zanele, with answering that question in the mix.
Yeah, and it's just having supportive policies and supportive regulation. What I've found is that industry operates here and the government operates on the sideline. So everyone dreads going to visit the TTI, for example. You know, and then there's certain individuals that are delegated to have those conversations and to try and bring the parties together. And it's been very, very difficult for most organizations. But I think when organizations band together towards a particular issue and a challenge, and they have ready solutions to that, I think it just makes the conversation and the steering of government and regulators in the right direction a little bit easier. But that whole system in terms of how industries and government interact and how they engage and how policy gets signed off and how it gets, legislated, there needs to be a bit more
bureaucracy.
Yeah, there needs to be a bit more, I think, interaction between government and business from that perspective. I mean, there's pockets of it that are going very, very well, but for the broader industries, I think there really needs to be a concerted effort from both parties to really find solutions around these, because at the end of the day, we all lose, right? Because if the employment rate continues to rise and people can't find employment, those are your consumers. So if they don't have money in their pocket to buy the products that most South African companies produce, then it's just, it's a virtuous cycle, I guess, with all components need to work together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to add onto that, so I saw the question, and in as far as the labor laws are concerned, I think South Africa has one of the most progressive labor laws in the world. I think where our challenge sits is having a long-term orientation around how we progressively want to move. One thing that China is good at is the long-term orientation. Yeah. So I think that's where the issue is, right? There's nothing wrong with the labor laws that we have. I think the social partners, labor organizations need to work a lot better and put a plan together that is a lot more long-term as opposed to short-term. But I do think there's a lot to learn from a regulatory standpoint. Countries like Rwanda, for instance, on our continent, have done an exceptional job in bringing investment into that country. And we have a lot to learn, from those countries. We need to make sure that the environment, promotes investment within the country and outside of the country. I think there's massive opportunity.
I think, Tumisang, you're right. I think what we have is learnings from China, because we've got a very adversarial approach. When we say labor in South Africa, and that's unfortunate. I have or am in contact with a South African that works in China, and labor, government, and business work together and resolve things immediately. And he was saying that what takes us in, let's say, the West, 2-3 months or even 2 years to do, they will probably do within weeks, because they all come together and focus on achieving something together. So changing a mindset is fundamental. Changing policies and how we work together is fundamental. Having tax breaks so that we can all invest correctly is fundamental. I think as a country, we've probably missed the manufacturing opportunity arena out there, because manufacturing has gone east. And I think what we need to do here is reskill for the digital world and try and go into a different way of competing. And if we do that, it might put us a step ahead. So there's an opportunity, but we all have to do it together. You can't leave things up to business. It doesn't happen on its own. And you need big capital to compete. And to compete, you need capacity. So you need to be a global player. You need to be able to export.
Definitely. I'm conscious of time. We've gotten to 11 o'clock. I think maybe just then to close, and I don't see any other questions on the chats either. Just to close, can we just talk about ESG and what role local supply or just the supply chain broadly can play towards decreasing the carbon footprint?
I think everyone's talking about it, and it's topical. And I think what this pandemic has brought about is it's put it on the table, and there's not a single corporation out there or company that's not aware of it and not trying to do something. One, two is, and maybe it's a blessing that we have crises with like Eskom, and everyone says, okay, so how can I get energy differently? Because whatever you manufacture, whatever you retail needs energy. It's in the modern world, urbanization, and that's the key. Water, resources, and electrical power or energy of some sort. And we all want to have a world tomorrow and trying to reduce our carbon footprints. What I'm dead against is, of course, to tax people to move in that direction, because that's creating an inefficiency. But if that tax goes towards helping to develop a more sustainable world, then that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But taxing it to put it into government coffers doesn't make sense. As the Consumer Goods Council, and I was quite active with it, we had all got together to have plastic bags at one standard price, and to try and have a way of reusing and recycling plastic bags in this country. And all that happened is that tax went into government coffers. To this day, it's not going into creating a recycling industry. It's just basically being eaten up by other priorities that government has, which is so unfortunate. So if taxes are going to be the way of moving forward for sustainability, then it needs to go to helping people to have a circular economy, recycle, and put it where it creates jobs.
Yeah. I think ESG is very important. It's been a topic of discussion for at least 2-3 years now, between investors and companies, and also from looking at sustainable growth and having organizations that exist, many years from where we are. And I think for me, the social aspect of ESG is one other important, aspect to look at. And I think most organizations need to think very strategically and also with the long-term view in terms of how they tackle some of the social aspects that are around their operations, for example. So there's many companies that have great programs that are more long-term focused and more sustainable in terms of how they deal with some of the social aspects that their businesses have an impact, and also dealing with issues that impact societies that around where they have operations. So it's creating employment opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities for communities, getting them involved in terms of the actual operations that are in the area, and getting communities being part of having certain organization residing in their communities because they know the benefits that they get from that. And then I think that bodes for sustainability in terms of how organizations need to approach some of these programs. So we don't have time to go into detail, but I thought I just need to mention that. And obviously governance is very, very crucial for most, whether you are a big corporate or you're a small corporate. Governance, very, very critical for sustainability.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe just to add on to that point is we need to really commit to this course as organizations, and we need to move with speed. I think that's the big thing. Once again, the issues around net zero emissions or carbon neutrality and so forth, they have been on the table for the longest of times. But we have just not met the commitments that we have put forward. So we need to take it serious, and we need to move with speed. But once again, I think South Africa is also doing a lot in that space. There is a regulation on EPR, extended producer responsibility, that was put in a couple of months ago, which I think is also going to address some of the structural issues, within the circular economy, but also address issues from a design point of view. We need to design packaging, for instance, that we know is going to help the cause, as opposed to, having to find solutions that are difficult to find later in the process. So there's a lot that's happening in that space. I think what is required of us is just to make sure that we move with speed.
Thank you very much to the panelists. You've been awesome. Thank you to the people that have attended. I hope that you did find it useful. If you still have additional questions for any of the panelists, I'm sure that you can send it through to Sentio, and we'll pass it on and get those questions answered for you. It's been very interesting. It's been a good morning. We ran slightly over, but I think that just is an indication of how interesting the conversation was. Thank you so much for your time. You've definitely shed more color onto the supply chain, which is something that you don't really think about, especially if you're ordering online. You just want your goods there. And this COVID pandemic has forced all of us to actually stop and think and understand just how the various parts are all interconnected. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. And yeah, we can continue on emails if there's anything else anyone else would like to know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.